So I want to talk U.S. foreign policy here a little bit. And there are a couple of things that I saw come out pertaining to foreign policy and how we come to our decisions, and also the results of our actions in the Middle East. So I want to start with a clip on breaking points. This is Richard Hanania. I hope I got that name right. He studies and writes about U.S. foreign policy, and this is him explaining how we think of it as being a decision-making process with authoritative people, and it's really just not. It's kind of just this chaotic clusterfuck of individual intentions that compile to make these macro decisions on foreign policy. Richard did a great job breaking this down, so this is a portion of his interview on breaking points.
Us now, great friend of the show, Richard Hanania. He is out with a new book, Public Choice Theory and the Illusion of Grand Strategy. Richard's been a great source of this show, particularly during the Afghanistan debacle. There was one story we wanted to get his take on, but also to talk about his book. So let's put that up there on the screen. Who won in Afghanistan? Well, it's private contractors. It turns out netted trillions of dollars while they were over there. Richard, talk to us a little bit about that and tie it to your fantastic book, which thank you very much, by the way, for sending it to us.
Yeah, absolutely. So my book argues, I've been studying international relations sort of as you guys are, as just a consumer of the news, but also academically. And so I've read, pretty much, all the important thinkers in international relations, the theories about what we're supposedly doing overseas. And I think that, I just came to the conclusion that people are basically thinking about the whole thing wrong, whether they think the U.S. Should have a prominent role in world affairs, whether they believe in support this war or that war. I think that the problem is, we think that there's actually somebody in charge, that there is a grand strategy where sort of like wise men are sitting around and sort of determining what the U.S. should be doing about Afghanistan, about Iraq, about the rise of China, about any number of things. And, I don't think that that's actually what's happening. I think Afghanistan is such a good way to sort of introduce people to the rest of what foreign policy is like, because the mistakes and the blunders and the sort of how disastrous it is and the waste and everything else. I mean, it's just so obvious and it's so clear. And it's been like that for 20 years. So yeah, that money in Afghanistan, the war of Afghanistan, just like the war in Iraq, the money runs into the spending runs into the trillions. A lot of it was government contractors, and the government contractors would do everything from build girls schools to supply the U.S. bases, to provide security. And these people got very, very wealthy. I mean, these people are one of the reasons why Washington D.C. has now basically every single one of the wealthiest counties in the country are around Washington D.C.
Yeah, that's right.
This is these people who made money off of Afghanistan, who made money off Iraq. We left Afghanistan, and the same people are in charge as they were when we originally went in. But yeah, I think foreign policy. I mean, I think it demonstrates that foreign policy is working. I mean, you could look at Iraq too. You say, what did we gain out of Iraq? Well, it didn't work. There's no actual tangible benefit you can point to for the American people there. But go look up every single person who was involved in the Iraq war. What are they doing now? They're not in jail. They haven't suffered any financial harm. Wolfowitz went on to lead the World Bank. Some of them are at the Hudson Institute, where people still tell us about what we should do on foreign policy next. So if you understand foreign policy this way, and this is a theme of my book, it's working. It's working the way the system is designed for certain interests, and it's helping those interests, and it's sort of working as designed. While if you think of in terms of national interest, you're going to be constantly confused by what we're doing overseas.
Right.
That's so well said. I mean, it seems to me that the people who get richest in Washington are the people who are willing to do the sketchiest stuff. So whether it's like war profiteering or selling yourself to the sketchiest possible foreign governments, those are the people who get really rich in this area. I think we have the book jacket we can put up on the screen. It's called Public Choice Theory and the Illusion of Grand Strategy: How Generals, Weapons Manufacturers, and Foreign Governments Shape American Foreign Policy. So Richard, take us through Afghanistan as a great case example here. I mean, how were these decisions made? How's the decision initially made to go in? How's the decision made to just continue and stay the course and lie to people and continue in this direction that we know has been and ultimately was a complete failure?
Yeah. So, I mean, when we ask the question, how was the decision made, it implies that a decision was made. And really, it basically wasn't. I mean, you don't have to take my word for it. I mean, I go through Iraq and Afghanistan. I have quotes from people who were involved in these decisions, and they themselves will tell you, we never talked about it. What were we going to do in Afghanistan? 9/11, something, it happened. We wanted to go back. We wanted to get revenge. We wanted to bring the people to justice. So they went into Afghanistan, and there was just no planning about what would happen after. They basically ended up drawing a constitution. It was done by people like the State Department and UN types who have these, standard idea of what makes a good government. So they just sort of implemented that on Afghanistan. We worked with the warlords, and then the U.S. troops were just basically walking around and not doing much. And there wasn't actually that violent for the first few years. Bush administration attention switched over to Iraq, and then Iraq is an entire different story. But yeah, this is basically what happened. And then Obama comes in, a decade later after this sort of drift, and he sort of is skeptical of the mission. The generals, they go and they basically do a full-on PR campaign. They're teaming up with Congress and saying, this is going to be a big disaster for Obama doesn't double down, this is going to be a disaster for the country. There's going to be the terrorist threat's going to go up, and they're leaking things to the Washington Post and other papers. And Obama decides to stay. Trump, it's the exact same story. I mean, that's what's so fascinating. He comes in and he's skeptical, and they basically just bully him and beat him down until he decides to continue on. And they try to do the same thing with Biden. And you can see how the justification changes throughout the whole process. So first it was terrorism. Then you had the Bush doctrine. It became sort of folded in with Iraq. With the Bush doctrine, the idea that you needed to democratize the world, or at least the Muslim countries, that started because they couldn't find the WMDs. Nobody talked about this before. There was no WMD. So Bush sort of needed a reason for Iraq to still make sense. Afghanistan sort of got caught up in that. And then in 2020, we're talking about women's rights and China and whatever. They're just throwing it whatever they can against the wall and seeing whatever sticks. So a lot of stuff works like this. Basically, you have these interests, they want a policy, and they're reverse engineering whatever arguments they want to make around the policy. And the policy is always keep doing what we're doing. If we have a commitment to a country, or we're in a certain region of the world, we have to stay. One of the things I point out in my book, and this is very interesting, that if you look at the countries that have the most U.S. troops right now, they're the same countries that had the most U.S. troops stationed there in 1950. So it's Germany, Italy, Japan, South Korea. So the U.S. is still occupying the Axis powers and basically fighting the Korean War, right? And I think 50, 60 years from now, we could still be doing the exact same thing, and everyone will have a reason why we need to be in Germany, Italy, Japan. I mean, we have to think, when Crystal said, the people willing to do sketchy things, I think they're people who, I think it selects for that, yes, but also for people who are able to convince themselves, what they need to believe. So I think a lot of these foreign policy people are sincere, but it's very easy to predict what their views are going to be, because all you have to do is think, well, whatever the U.S. is doing right now has to be kept being done, and you're usually going to be correct. You're usually going to be able to predict their views at any particular issue.
Well, that's actually what I wanted to follow up with. Is it just as simple as follow the money? Or is it follow the money and the power and the ideology? Like, what are the interests actually at stake here?
I think we really underplay the money, because I don't think money is everything. I think power and the ideology is very important. But look, the money is absolutely huge. So when you have basically every 3- and 4-star general now, when retiring, going to work for a defense contractor, it's 100% or close to it in the last decade and a half. Basically, anytime you see a general, he's going to and he's near the end of his career, he's going to be working for a weapons manufacturer or some kind of government contractor soon. So in any other industry, we sort of look at this and we get suspicious. There was a Post story I was involved in where they talked about this, that these people are, they're on boards of, Boeing or whatever corporation, and they're not being introduced they're not being introduced by people telling them this is actually a corporate representative. Nikki Haley, when she was on Boeing, I think she left the board, but when she was there, they'd say Nikki Haley's former UN ambassador. They wouldn't say Nikki Haley, current board member of Boeing. So the money is important, and the the ideology works with it, because I think what the money does is it follows the people with the correct ideology.
Mm-hmm.
So it's both. So I think someone like, John Bolton, it's funny when you read John Bolton's memoir, he's talking about like how busy he is because all these corporate like consultants want him, and like he's going to be he's on the phone and having to juggle like all these commitments just because he's like such a hit in business. I think John Bolton, I think he believes, I think he believes in something. He seems to love war more than even his self-interest would recommend. But it's people like that who are going to rise to the top because they have the right ideology to be supported with the people with the resources and power. So you can't say really it's either or. I think you need both to make for American foreign policy.
So I thought that was a really fantastic breakdown, and the way he kind of described at the end there, I think we tend to think of corruption as working in only one direction. And what I mean is we think of it as this very direct quid pro quo. You pay me, I do X, Y, or Z for you, right? It really is often a lot more discreet than that. And I'll use the example of like how I think it works in media. I don't think that the president of MSNBC or CNN has to explicitly go to the personalities at their network and express the kind of coverage that they want done. I don't think it has to happen that explicitly. I think their hiring practices are determined by what kind of coverage they want, right? So we covered like Chris Cillizza last week and his humiliating breakdown of the New York Times potential 2024 Democratic nominee for president candidates, right? I don't think Cillizza has ever had to be told in his life that he needs to dumb down his coverage or be more friendly to the powers that be. I think he still has his job because that's what he does. So you see how it can go both ways. And I think that's what Richard was describing there in the military-industrial complex. The people who rise to power in the American foreign policy establishment are those who already have the desired opinions. So they've come through the institutions that are there to instill these opinions on them, right? To sort of just dictate how these people view the world. And then once they have those opinions, they get the job. So it never really even has to be as explicit as the quid pro quo that we tend to think about, right? But it still has that same financial, self-interested incentive structure that drives the entire thing. So he mentions Bolton there at the end, right? John Bolton, I think, very much believes all of the horrendous nonsense that he espouses. And that is exactly why he's constantly on cable news, and that's why every administration brings him in to advise. And so I think we have to sort of I think a lot of corruption happens in more nuanced ways than how we sort of visualize it. And I think Richard broke it down very well there. And as it pertains to he kind of mentions there's not really a decision-making process in the way that we think that there is, right? I think we all kind of think of it as like there's like 10 people in a room who are the powers that be that sit around and make these decisions well in advance and plan this all out in a big picture scheme sort of way. And I think what he's saying is, no, what it really is all of these self-interested people who are engaging in that fashion. And then the result that you get is just this sort of, it's almost like a democracy of self-interest. It's like what outcome is best for most of the people who have say, and that's the outcome that you get, right? So, and he mentioned also like these generals that do the revolving door thing. They're immediately, you guys, you can be a general in the United States military and be wrong about everything your entire career for decades. You can talk about strategies that turn out to miserably fail. You can support wars that are disasters and catastrophes and lead to massive civilian death. And you will still be paraded up there on the mainstream outlets as though you are knowledgeable and as though you have expertise and as though your opinion is worth listening to. Very similar. I was talking last week about political commentary. You can be wrong your whole career and still be treated like an expert. That happens in foreign policy too. Okay. And he gave the great example of Nikki Haley while she's on the board of Boeing. She's not introduced that way, you guys, right? You never see him on cable news. I'm going back a little bit, but Bernie's ex-campaign chair was on, I think it was MSNBC, and called out Heidi Heitkamp for spewing a bunch of establishment-friendly nonsense while she was taking money from corporations and banks and whoever the fuck else she takes money from. He calls her out for that on cable news. And the host, whose job it was, by the way, to initially mention that Heidi Heitkamp is taking money from these sources, if they want to be objective at all, the host pushes back and says, well, we're not questioning Heidi Heitkamp's integrity, are we? I know we're not doing that. So, like, they play defense for the very corruption that they're supposed to call out. So all of these dynamics, I think, are at play on both in the media infrastructure and in the foreign policy infrastructure. And there's some overlap there, too, because they have to manufacture consent for these wars. Right. We wouldn't have been in Iraq, you guys, if the entire media did not kick into gear to support us going into Iraq. MSNBC famously fired some of their most popular characters, or personalities rather, because they refused. Ed Schultz was fired by MSNBC because he refused to support the Iraq war. There were a couple of others too. Chris Hedges fired by MSNBC because he refused to support the Iraq war. Tom Hartman. Okay, so the media kicked into full gear to support this war. Cenk Uygur, I got all the issues in the world with TYT, you guys, but there's this story that I don't know how many of you have heard this, that Cenk tells about when he was at MSNBC. And I wish I could remember the guy's name. The president, longtime president, no longer, recently stepped down. Someone put it in the chat, the ex-president of MSNBC until maybe about a year ago, 6 months ago. He basically told Cenk to water his coverage down on Iraq and Afghanistan, our foreign policy. And Cenk essentially said no, and a couple weeks later he was let go. So Cenk tells this story to describe how explicit it can be when you actually, step out of line. My point is, I think so few actually step out of line that explicit conversation is hardly ever necessary, right? And I think that applies to both of these fields. So anyway, a great job there from Richard breaking down how the incentives actually interact with each other to formulate the decisions that are made on U.S. foreign policy, and how catastrophic that was. Obvious, but how we've created more terrorists with the war on terror. We purport to be there to try to fight terrorism and extremism, and instead we end up creating a lot more terrorists in doing so. And just to briefly explain this dynamic, groups over there, like they literally use videos of U.S. officials in their recruitment process. So when you have a U.S. Secretary of State or U.S. Secretary of Defense or U.S. Vice President or a high-ranking senator or what have you, essentially supporting our continued unnecessary offensive wars all over the world, that gets then used to recruit new members to these extremist groups. So we're actually creating jihadists and working with jihadists while we claim that our job is to combat terror and fight against terror. So it's, regardless of the position that you want to take on the Middle East in general, our role has been to do the exact opposite of what we claim. And that's kind of the point, right? I'm not fucking pro-jihadist, you guys. There are a lot of horrendous groups out there, and the theocratic, ultra-conservative ideology that these groups grasp onto is detrimental and horrible. I'm not pro-fucking jihadist. I'm also not pro the United States enhancing that. I'm not in support of my government going out there and helping jihadists. Okay, so that's the point of this piece here. This is in Jacobin by Nick Terse. The war on terror has been very successful at creating new terrorists. The supposed point of the war on terror was to stop terrorism. Instead, the war on terror has created many, many more terrorists. It began more than 2 decades ago. On September 20th, 2001, President George W. Bush declared a war on terror and told the joint session of Congress and the American people that the course of this conflict is not known, yet its outcome is certain. If he meant a 20-year slide to defeat in Afghanistan, a proliferation of militant groups across the greater Middle East and Africa, and a never-ending world-spanning war that at a minimum has killed about 300 times the number of people murdered in America on 9/11. That really is minimum, you guys. That's the most conservative estimate. Then give him credit. He was absolutely right. Days earlier, Congress had authorized Bush to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determined planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons. That's very vague authorization, you might notice. By then, it was already evident, as Bush said in his address, that al-Qaeda was responsible for the attacks. But it was equally clear that he had no intention of conducting a limited campaign. Quote, "Our war on terror begins with al-Qaeda, but it does not end there," he announced. "It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated." This was an important piece because it allowed us to continue that war well beyond what its initial intentions were. Congress had already assented to whatever the president saw fit to do. It had voted 420-1 in the House and 98-0 in the Senate to grant an authorization for use of military force that would give him and presidents to come essentially a free hand to make war around the world. Quote, "I believe that it's broad enough for the president to have the authority to do all that he needs to do to deal with this terrorist attack and threat," Senate Minority Leader Trent Lott said at the time. "I also think that it is tight enough that the constitutional requirements and limitations are protected." Boy, was Senator Lott ever wrong about that one. The AUMF would, however, quickly become a blank check for boundless war. In the 2 decades since, the 2001 authorization for use of military force has been formally invoked to justify counterterrorism operations, including ground combat, airstrikes, detention, and the support of partner militaries in 22 countries, according to a new report by Stephanie Saville of Brown University's Costs of War Project. During that same time, the number of terrorist groups threatening Americans and American interests has, according to the U.S. State Department, more than doubled. That, again, you guys, very conservative estimate, especially pertaining to the number of members of these groups. Under that AUMF, U.S. troops have conducted missions across 4 continents. The countries in question include some of little surprise, like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and a few unexpected nations, like Georgia and Kosovo. Quote, "In many cases, the executive branch inadequately described the full scope of U.S. actions," writes Saville, noting the regular invocation of vague language, pretzeled logic, and weak explanations. In other cases, the executive branch reported on support for CT operations, but did not acknowledge that troops were or could be involved in hostilities with militants. So the point here is that even according to the U.S. State Department, we have over doubled the size and number of groups that we are purporting to fight in the Middle East. It has been a catastrophic failure by any metric that you want to use. And again, I just want to be clear, you guys, there's this false dichotomy that I think often applies to foreign policy where you look at it in a vacuum and pick a good guy and a bad guy. And more often than not, by a wide margin, in fact, the vast majority of the time that we're talking about foreign policy conflicts, every actor involved is a bad one. Vast majority of the time, this included, okay? ISIS, bad actors. Al-Qaeda, bad actors. United States, also very bad actors, okay? And I just really want to drive that point home, that when we analyze these things, we need to not engage in the kind of nationalism that that the media and pop culture try to impress upon us. And it's also it's very much worth pointing out, I think the most effective argument, we can make arguments about the military industrial complex. We can point out all the civilian death and all of this stuff. And those are all very strong arguments to me. To me, those are all enough to very clearly, find or whatever that our decisions have been bad. The military industrial complex and the civilian death alone amount to enough evidence that we were wrong here. But I think the most effective arguments against those who still support these wars are to point out that we've done the opposite of what we said we were doing. So to those who would sit there and say civilian death is horrible, but it's collateral and it's unfortunate, but it's necessary. Okay, well, how about the fact that we did the exact opposite of what we said we were going to go over there to do? So what were those deaths for? So that we could double the strength and authority and leverage that Al-Qaeda has? Like, we leave Afghanistan 20 years later and the same fucking people are in charge as when we got there. So you want to, if you want to try to minimize the extent of the damage that we lefties like to talk about a lot, you also have to explain why it is that you support an operation that had the opposite of the quote unquote intended effect. So U.S. foreign policy in a nutshell is a contradiction. It's a paradox. It's hypocritical. It's entirely dishonest. You guys, we support at any given, over the last couple of decades, at any given time, we've supported like 75 to 85% of the world's dictatorships, whether financially or through being allies or, in any other way, rhetorically, whatever it might be. 75 to 85% of the dictatorships we support. And then we turn around and we say, oh, well, our foreign policy is all about freedom and democracy and this and that, right? Just look at Saudi Arabia. We claim we're all about freedom and democracy. We support one of the most authoritarian, theocratic states in the world. You know what Saudi Arabia is, you guys? That's ISIS that made it as a country. That's what Saudi Arabia is. And we support them and participate in their genocide in Yemen. We and 11 other countries or whatever it is, the coalition. So you just look at Saudi Arabia and you can see the extent of the hypocrisy, the rank hypocrisy that just essentially makes up our foreign policy. So I wanted to make sure to touch on that because I thought those two pieces, the Jacobin piece and Richard's interview were fantastic. I encourage my audience to go follow Richard's work as well. He wrote a whole book on this stuff. So, go follow Richard Hanania and inform yourself on these issues. So, and another, sort of tangentially related story here that's on foreign policy. It's about Iran. Again, I want to make sure to set the stage here properly. Both bad guys. Not a fan of the Iranian government, you guys. Not a fan of an ultra-conservative, theocratic, authoritarian government. Not a fan, okay? Also not a fan of how the United States has handled the, conflict with Iran, the ongoing, perpetual conflict with Iran going back decades and decades and decades. So this is about how Trump murdered one of Iran's top generals. And Iran is now calling for Trump and Pompeo to face consequences for that. This is in the Hill. Iran calls for Trump, Pompeo to face trial for Soleimani assassination. And just for comparison, you guys, imagine what would happen if Iran decided to assassinate one of our top generals. Soleimani was even almost above generals. He was such an important figure in the Iranian military. It would almost be like a Secretary of Defense or something being assassinated. Imagine how the United States would respond if Iran did that. Just imagine. We would be at war in 2 seconds flat. There would be nukes flying to Iran the moment the president heard the news. I mean, it wouldn't even be we think we have this privilege to engage in acts of war. And yet if other countries were to do the same, we would hit them with everything that we fucking have. It's just rank hypocrisy. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi is calling for former President Trump and former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to face trial for the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, who was killed in January 2020 drone strike ordered by Trump. Raisi, in a speech on Monday, said Trump and Pompeo should be tried in a fair court for the assassination of Soleimani. He called Trump an aggressor, murderer, and the main culprit. If Trump and Pompeo are not tried in a fair court for the criminal act of assassinating General Soleimani, Muslims will take our martyrs' revenge, Raisi said. Now, there you get the extreme response that Raisi, by the way, relatively new president in Iran, hard-line conservative. They swung to the right this last election cycle. So Raisi is a maniac. The aggressor, murderer, and main culprit, and then president of the United States, must be tried and judged under the Islamic law of retribution, and God's ruling must be carried out against him. So as you can see, like I said right off the bat, you guys, no good guys here, okay? We engaged in an active war knowing full well that Iran would not do anything about it because we can crush them like a little bug. So we take advantage of that in order to bully the rest of the world, and that's horrendous and egregious. And yes, Trump and Pompeo, by the way, should be at the Hague for war crimes. So Raisi is not wrong in what he's saying here. He's just wrong about the whole, he should be tried under Islamic law. I mean, I'm sorry, it's just fucking utterly ridiculous. Soleimani was killed near Baghdad's airport on January 3rd, 2020 in a drone strike that Trump ordered. Quote, "We took action last night to stop a war. We did not take action to start a war," Trump said in a statement. Can we just think about that for a second? I'll again ask you to engage in the thought experiment. What if Iran assassinated one of our top generals, and then when we went to retaliate, they said, wait, no, hold up. We didn't do that to start a war. We did it to prevent a war. So call off the forces. We all would laugh at that, wouldn't we? And the whole world would laugh at that, wouldn't they? As they're laughing at Trump and Pompeo for this outrageous statement. You engage in an act of war and then say it's to prevent a war. I mean, it's like the most Orwellian thing. War is peace, right? The Pentagon at the time said it carried out the mission because Soleimani was actively developing plans to attack American diplomats and service members in Iraq and throughout the region, and was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans and coalition service members and the wounding of thousands more. Let's also evaluate that for a moment, you guys. We're claiming self-defense as an occupying force. They type that out as though it's perfectly rational and reasonable without reading it back and going, hang on, wait a minute. U.S. troops where? In Iraq. Claiming what? Self-defense. While they are what? An occupying force. Paradoxical, hypocritical, nonsensical. Okay, from the start. And this is also not accurate, quite frankly. Soleimani was fighting ISIS, you guys. Again, no fan of the Iranian government, not here to simp for the Iranian government. But Soleimani, his task was fighting ISIS. So what did the United States do by assassinating Soleimani? What did we do? We sided with the jihadists, which we've done all too often, okay? That's what we did. And then we turned around and tried to say, we're in Iraq to fight the jihadists, who we're now supporting by assassinating Soleimani, and we're also going to claim self-defense while we're an occupying... I mean, do you guys see how ridiculous this all gets very quickly? There's no, and it's about what Richard was talking about. There's no sensible decision-making process when it comes to the United States foreign policy. Pompeo also defended the strike, saying, quote, "We are definitely safer today." You took out someone fighting ISIS who you claim you're there to fight, and then you say we're safer because we took out this guy who's also fighting the same enemy that we say we're in the region to fight. You guys see how, you know that meme where the woman is looking all confused and it's just a whole bunch of numbers and question marks and shit? That's what this is. That is U.S. foreign policy. So shame on Trump and Pompeo, and shame on Raisi for going all like you should be tried in an Islamic court. I mean, this is an insane story, an unhinged story from all sides. United States wrong on Iranian policy for decades. We have long been the aggressor and the first to break deals, and we've done numerous coups in Iran and all this, right? So we deserve all the pushback we get. And Trump and Pompeo engaging in an active war and then asserting that they did so to stop a war is one of the most ridiculous things that I have ever heard. So unfortunate situation in Iran, you guys, that by the way, one of the reasons you get those extremists in Iran, one of the reasons, I'm not saying the only reason, I'm no expert on domestic politics. Anyway, he talked about how in Iran those elections in part went the way that they did because the United States broke our word so many times. So the moderates in Iran who had worked with the Obama administration to sign the nuclear deal were essentially like, we made a fool out of them for trusting us. The Quincy Institute, thank you. If Quincy Institute, if anyone was wondering. So we essentially we make fools out of the people who were willing to work with us and sign a deal with us. Well, how do you think that's going to affect Iranian politics? Of course, then the hardline conservative theocratic maniacs can come in and say, you have no business trusting them at all. And they're going to look smart. They were down on the deal from the start, you guys, and they were accusing the moderates of being fools and being naive. And what did the U.S. do? We went and proved the extremists correct. So this again, it's like a self-fulfilling. We have extremists in Iran now unwilling to sign another deal, in part because we violated our end of the deal, which made the moderates look ridiculous. So, we're wrong on virtually every side of this, and it's just an all around terrible situation in Iran right now, and the United States, the effect that we have had on that country and on that region is beyond egregious. And to go back to that Jacobin article, we are fostering extremism. We are creating extremism. We're not combating it. We're not fighting it. Nothing of the sort. So wanted to make sure that everybody knows those are the talking points to fire back at your imperialist, the imperialists in your life. Make sure they understand we are creating more terrorists and creating more extremism than we are combating.